Hello. In this recording we're going to be looking at overheads and how we can calculate overhead absorption rates using blanket rates. Overhead costs are indirect costs, and as such they can't be directly associated with individual units of production. However, a business has to calculate selling prices for its products, and those selling prices are based on the total cost of producing the product, which has to incorporate the overheads. Referring to this cost summary, we can see that our prime cost is made up of our direct costs, so that's direct material, direct labour and direct expenses, and then we add our overheads. Firstly, we add the production overheads. We've got a couple of examples. We could be adding the factory rent, the factory heat and light. That gives us the production cost. Then we add our non-production overheads. For example, the selling and distribution overheads, or the administration overheads. And then we get the total cost of producing our product. Now, if we're producing a cost summary for an organisation as a whole for a period of time, so perhaps we want to produce a cost summary for the month, that would be relatively easy to do. We could pick up all our direct costs for the month from our records. We could find out what our monthly rent is, we could find out what our monthly heat and light cost is and include those. And then we could do the same for our non-production overheads. So we would have a total cost of production for the month. However, we may want to know the cost of production for one unit so that we can then work out the selling price for that unit. It then becomes a little bit more complicated, because how are we going to decide how much of the production overhead related to the production of one unit? So how much of the factory rent relates to the production of one unit? How much of the factory heat and light relates to the production of one unit? So we need to find a method of dealing with that. And the method that we use is called absorption costing. So we're going to look at an example which illustrates this. This example is based on a car service business. So a new business has been opened by Adam and Bernard in a rented garage. And they're calculating their prices in order to ensure they make a profit. So they already have the details of the prices of the materials that they could use. So for example, the price of the oil, the price of filters. And they've already decided what labour rate to charge for their own time. They don't intend to employ anybody else. However, there are other costs that will be incurred. They're renting the garage, so there's that rent. There's the heat and light of the garage. There's the insurance of the garage. So in other words, they're overheads. And they're trying to work out how to incorporate these overheads into their price structure. They have estimated that in total their overheads are likely to be £40,000 per annum. So that's their estimated overheads. In other words, for estimated, budgeted. They've also calculated that they expect to work 5,000 hours during the year. So again, an estimated or a budgeted figure. So they can use these two figures if they are going to incur £40,000 of overheads and they're going to be working 5,000 hours, then we can work out that for every hour they work, it is costing them £8 an hour. So that's for every labour hour, it costs £8 in overheads. This £8 per labour hour is the overhead absorption rate. And it's often referred to as the OAR, overhead absorption rate. So Adam and Bernard can now use that information. So for example, if a particular service they're going to carry out on a car is going to take 3 hours, then they can charge 3 hours at £8 an hour, so £24 in overheads. So in addition to the material costs for the service and the labour costs for the service, they've now got an overhead cost for a service. So just to remind you what we need to consider when we're working out the cost of our products or services, we firstly need the direct material cost, the direct labour cost, any direct expenses, and then that gives us the prime cost. Then we add overheads. In this example, we've lumped all our overheads together, production and non-production. So add the overheads, and we have the total cost of production, or the total cost of our product, which can also be referred to as the absorption cost. So the absorption cost is the total cost. So for the example that we've just looked at in terms of a service, if the materials used for the service had a cost of £30, so our direct material cost is £30, it took 3 hours to carry out that service, and the labour cost, so this is the rate of pay for the mechanics who are carrying out the service, are £12 an hour. So in terms of labour, 3 times 12, £36 in labour. There are no direct expenses, so the prime cost, £66. We now need to add the overheads. We know that overheads are £8 for every labour hour worked, and this service takes 3 labour hours. So our overheads, 3 hours at £8 an hour, gives us £24. So the absorption cost, or the total cost of providing the service, is £90. So that's the prime cost plus the overheads. Now, assuming the garage wants to make a profit, it will need to charge its customers more than £90. So for example, if the garage wants to make a 50% profit, we would add another 50% onto the £90, and the price to charge the customer for the service would be £135. And at that figure, they should be making £45 profit, and they will have covered all of their costs, including the overheads. As we've worked out the cost that Adam and Bernard are going to charge for a service, £135, Adam and Bernard can now quote their customer. So therefore, we need to know what our absorption rates are before we produce our products or before we quote our customers. And then it is up to the customer whether they accept our quote or not. So we need to work out our overhead absorption rates before we start producing or providing the service. And therefore, we have to work them out on budgeted or estimated figures, exactly as we did in the example with Adam and Bernard. So overhead absorption rates are always calculated taking the budgeted overhead and dividing it by the budgeted activity level. What we mean by activity level is either dividing it by labour hours, as we did in the example with Adam and Bernard, or we can divide by machine hours. We could divide by number of units produced, or there are other methods of calculating overhead absorption rates. There are other bases that we could use. So labour hours, machine hours, units produced, these are suitable bases for calculating overhead absorption rates. But we could use the cost of material. We could use number of miles travelled. It really depends upon what situation we're looking at. But the most common ones are labour hours or machine hours. So the overhead absorption rate, always calculated using budgeted overheads divided by budgeted activity level. And then you decide upon what your activity level is going to be, depending upon the information provided in a question. Now we can calculate an overhead absorption rate for the whole business, or we can calculate an overhead absorption rate for individual departments within the business. If we calculate overhead absorption rates for the whole business, they are referred to as blanket rates. If we calculate them for departments, they're referred to as departmental rates. There is then another method of calculating overhead absorption rates, which is activity-based costing. We're not going to look at that one. So we're just going to look at blanket rates and departmental rates. So let's start with blanket rates. So this is a rate for the whole business. There are a number of steps that we will go through. First is to identify the total overhead costs. Remember, these must be budgeted. That's important. Then decide what basis we're going to use. So what is going to be the budgeted activity level? Are we going to be using labour hours, machine hours, units, or something else? Then we can divide the one by the other. So divide our overheads by our activity. That will give us the overhead absorption rate. Then we can use the overhead absorption rate to calculate how much overhead we're going to add to the prime cost. When we refer to adding overheads to the prime cost, we are actually absorbing overheads, hence the name absorption rates. So absorbing means adding. So let's look at another example. So we have a business producing 2 products, including a product called the XR12, and is expected to incur the following overhead costs. So expected tells us that's the budget. So we've got a number of overhead costs here. Power, heat and light, setup costs, invoicing costs, dispatch costs, a total of £43,000 in overheads. This is in the next accounting period. So again, that tells us it's a budgeted figure because it's what's going to happen in the future. We're told that the business uses a labour hour blanket rate. So that means the basis or the budgeted activity level is going to be labour hours. It expects to produce 2,000 XR12. Each XR12 takes 5 hours to produce, and in total the business expects to work 20,000 labour hours in the next period. So we need to calculate the overhead to be absorbed by each unit of XR12. So step 1, just have a look, identify the total overhead costs for the business. Remember, these must be budgeted. So our budgeted overhead cost is £43,000. Step 2, a suitable basis for absorption, such as labour hours, machine hours or units. So we have been told that the business use a labour hour blanket rate. So we are going to divide our overhead by our labour hours. Now it's very important that you look at the time periods. So we're told the overhead costs in the next accounting period are 43,000. So we need to divide that by the labour hours in the next accounting period. So we are not going to just pick out the figure of 5 hours because that's just how long one product takes. We want to know what the labour hours are going to be in the next accounting period. So that's the 20,000. So that's step 2. Step 3 is to calculate the overhead absorption rate. So I'll abbreviate to OAR. So it's the budgeted overhead cost divided by the budgeted activity level, which is the labour hours, and that gives us £2.15 per labour hour. Very important that when you work out your overhead absorption rate that you do write per labour hour after it. The answer is not just £2.15, it is £2.15 per labour hour. If you were dividing by machine hours, then it would be £2.15 per machine hour. So that's step 3. We now have an overhead absorption rate. And step 4, calculate the overhead to be absorbed by each product by multiplying the OAR by the activity used in producing the product. So our OAR is £2.15 per labour hour. So the overhead absorbed, and remember absorbed means added, so how much overhead are we going to add to the prime cost of our product? Well, we know that the overheads are £2.15 per labour hour, and how many labour hours does a product take to produce? Well, if we go back to the example, each XR12 is expected to take 5 hours. So the overhead absorbed, £2.15 times 5 gives us £10.75. So the XR12, we would be looking for the direct material cost, the direct labour, the direct expenses. That gives us the prime cost. Then we add overheads, and that gives us the total or absorption cost. So direct material plus direct labour plus direct expenses equals prime cost plus the overheads equals the total absorption cost. So what we know for 1 unit is how much we would add in overheads. This particular example hasn't given us the other costs, but we know that whatever these other costs were, which we call X, we would add £10.75 to that to give us our total cost. Then we can quote the customer based on that total cost. So that is how you calculate an overhead absorption rate, and it's called a blanket rate because for all the different products throughout the whole business that may be produced, for every one of those products we would work out the overheads based on £2.15 per labour hour. So that brings us to the end of this recording, which has explained what is meant by absorption costing and how to calculate a blanket rate.